Good afternoon. Welcome to this session on doing business at the next frontier. I know people are still walking in after lunch, but I propose we get started since we have a fairly tight schedule and a lot of interesting panelists. My name is Tarun, and my task is to moderate this panel. I am quickly going to say a couple of words about the questions that the panel will address, the broad contours of the questions that we are concerned with, and give you a quick sense of who's on the panel. I'm sure you've read the bios and are aware. We have a good spectrum of experience represented here. And we've all agreed on an order that we're going to go in. I'll introduce the panelists in the order that we agreed. And we hope to then open it up to the room for a discussion of some sorts. None of us will be making any speeches. We will simply be very, very succinct. The idea is we had a struggle in terms of deciding what constituted a frontier market and what was an emerging market, and decided that we weren't quite sure. Other than to say that, at least as witnessed by things like the Morgan Stanley indexes and the Financial Times various lists of countries, it appears that frontier markets are generally further behind in institutional development, and at some point they seem to graduate to what people think of as emerging markets. So China and India and Brazil are regarded as emerging markets, and then at some point they graduate into the so-called developed nirvana of some sort. That seems to be the progression. And one of the themes that we could explore, if the panel is amenable, is the differences between frontier and emerging markets, or what causes that institutional development to occur. As it turns out, we have successful business people and entrepreneurs, some from the frontier markets and some global corporations represented on the panel. And we have some policymakers and policymakers turned politicians, and we have a banker sitting here. My role is as an academic at Harvard for the last 20 years and an investor in several emerging markets myself. So I will try to round out the experiences and try to fill in the gaps if I do see any, but I doubt there'll be any gaps because the experience is pretty comprehensive. What I propose is we start with Don Lam. Don has been running a very interesting business in Vietnam for the last 16 years, I think, building up an investment powerhouse of sorts, and he'll give us the entrepreneur perspective. Elizabeth from Visa will go next. Erik from Nalco with his energy conservation and waste business will go next. Simeon, who I've known for many years when he had an academic policy guise and is now politician and statesman in Bulgaria, will speak of some of the policy challenges, particularly from a small frontier market, emerging market. And Mr. Hongjie is the vice president of the Export-Import Bank of China and our host, so I requested him to go last. So without further ado, I'll invite Don to take 3 minutes. Don. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that. As an intro, we manage about $2 billion in Vietnam, and we've been doing business in Vietnam for over 16 years, and so we do experience a lot of these frontier sort of characteristics. We just made a first investment in Cambodia recently, so another frontier market. So to me, I think frontier market is really characterized by really high growth rate, but also a lot of volatility. For example, in Vietnam in 2006, our stock market was up 145%. Now that's the best performing market in the world in 2006. And then 2008, the market went back down 66%. So that's sort of volatility that you can see, but really overall, I believe the frontier market is where some of the best opportunities there are in terms of from an investment perspective, where you can achieve really high growth rate, but you do expect volatility. And then I think for investors who are looking at potentially diversifying, essentially from delinking between the frontier market and the developed economy, this is where you can play in. Thank you.
Okay, so I should start by explaining what Visa is, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. We are a global payments network. We're not a credit card company. We don't issue cards, lend money. We basically move money, about $5 trillion of it per year across our network. And electronification of payments is a key to economic growth. Moody's did a study and said from 2003 to 2008, the electronification of payments added $1.1 trillion to to global GDP, and that's roughly a 50 basis point increase in global GDP. And obviously the frontier markets are key to that. And what we found is that the hallmark is innovation at a very accelerated pace, and you have to know what your business is, but you have to be very open to how to do it in different ways. For example, our business in Pakistan is the government delivering benefits to people displaced by conflict or catastrophe on a Visa prepaid card. That's how they get their benefits. Mobile as a channel for financial services is critical in frontier markets. These markets are places where you have 1 billion people who have a mobile device, but they don't have a bank account, and they're never going to have a plastic card. They will use their mobile phone for payments. So as we look at these markets, it's critical to enter them with a sense of innovation, to be open to setting standards and interoperability, and to partnering with the government where possible to align your agenda.
Elizabeth, could you give an example of where this has gone back to the developed world?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that. So really, the frontier markets, Visa operates in 170 countries. Our biggest countries are the obvious ones, United States, Canada, Australia. All of the innovation around mobile payments happens in frontier markets. That then comes back to places like the United States that inform how do you really turn a mobile device into a payment device.
Thank you.
I'm with Nalco, and we are an industrial water treatment and energy services company, energy services related to water treatment. $4 billion global company with about $1 billion in sales in the BRIC plus countries, BRIC plus the frontier markets. And because of the industrial growth, the oil and gas related industry growth, and water challenges of the frontier markets and the BRIC markets, we're growing about 30% per year in these markets. We've been there a long time. We've learned a lot of lessons. And I would say that 3 key lessons that we've learned is one is make sure that you go into these frontier markets making a strategic commitment to go through the good and the bad times, because going in and out is not going to work. Secondly, make sure that you put your talented entrepreneurial people that can be successful there and hire very good local people in and get good partners. And then third, build the right relationships with not only customers but also government officials and people that you need, partners that you'll need to be successful. And let me give you 2 quick examples of where we've learned lessons the hard way and adapted. One is in West Africa, where we went into a huge oil project with a global super major oil company. We were their partner. We won the business. They gave us the business. We put lots of project people on it for several years. We were ready to start the business, and the local oil company decided that some other supplier ought to come in and get the business. Well, we hadn't built the right relationships with that national oil company, which we've subsequently fixed, but that was a very hard lesson to learn, that those relationships are really critical with the government and the local government companies. Second example was, I think we're all challenged by corruption or bribery issues in some of these countries. We had a situation in Southeast Asia where we had a very good piece of business. Our rep came back and said that the customer was asking for a bribe, or else they were going to take the business away from us. We said, of course, we won't do that, so we lost the business. But the lesson there was we were working with very low-level people at the customer site, which was fine, but we weren't working with the higher-level people explaining the value that we were bringing and work through any issues like that. So there are challenges like that, but they can be addressed by understanding the markets and dealing with the markets in the right way.
And what if there's high-level corruption?
Then that's probably a company that you don't want to work with. But there's plenty of companies in these markets, plenty of customers, plenty of opportunities of very sound, principled companies to realize the growth. You can keep your global standards, but still realize very aggressive growth in these frontier markets. That's our conclusion. That's our commitment, and I think we've learned how to do that.
Great. Thanks, Erik. Simeon, do you?
Thank you. One of the main distinctions between an emerging market and a frontier market, which we just discussed, is the level of institutional development. But I think if you take that as a given, then another, perhaps less discussed distinction is just market size. In other words, I would argue that if two countries have roughly the same institutions, but one of them has a much larger market, then it could be considered an emerging market simply because it can attract more investors that can use this market. So I think part of the success of countries like Brazil, like India, like China, like Russia, is not so much that they suddenly have acquired much better institutions, but simply because they're larger and investors want to be there. So then the question is, well, if you're a small country like Bulgaria, what do you do about it, since you're not going to acquire the large market size? Well, it turns out that even among smaller markets, smaller countries, there is a further distinction, and it is, are you a neighbor of a large market, and can you be an entry way into that market? Well, Bulgaria luckily is. It's since 2007 a member of the European Union, one of the smallest countries in the European Union, but because of its many links to some of the former, let's say, socialist countries, including countries like India and China, in recent years, months in fact, after the financial crisis is petering away, it has become an entryway for large Chinese investments, for example, that originally set up shop in Bulgaria, and then from there hope, they say, the investors say, enter the whole European Union market. Because as those of you who invest in Europe know, once you get a license in any of the European Union countries, you can operate throughout the European Union. So in other words, there is kind of a niche market for smaller countries to compete for being the entry point of a large market near them. In Bulgaria's case, that's the European Union. How do you get that? Well, some historical links, as I mentioned, but also in the case of Bulgaria, I found two other things to be important. One of them is the level of taxation, corporate taxation. That is, if you have low corporate taxes, overall, I mean, not just profit tax, but VAT and so on, then that tends to attract a lot more investors. And in the year and a half that we've been in government, we've gone from being the seventh, among the 27 countries of the EU, the country with the seventh lowest tax burden. Currently, we're the second country. So in other words, we've managed to surpass 5 other countries that have increased taxes. So that's one thing. And the other thing that matters a lot to investors is the level of development of infrastructure, just pure physical infrastructure, road, electricity, does water work, this kind of things that in developed markets are more or less taken as a given, but in most emerging frontier markets, this is still a comparative advantage. And these are the two areas, low burden of taxation and infrastructure development, that the current Bulgarian government is trying to develop over our competitors.
Thank you, Simeon.
China Import and Export Bank. Listening to the Minister's remarks on markets, very hard to differentiate between the different types of developing countries and so on. Now, how do you subdivide between these different countries, and is it really useful? Now, some emerging markets are of relatively small size and liquidity, but at the same time, we find that, you know, if you're in such and such frontier market, you can reach much higher returns, but with higher risks. Now, our bank's viewpoint is that certain of these countries are well worth the effort. There are many business opportunities there. China Exim Bank, when it decides whether or not to go into these countries to do business there, first of all, it looks at the level of economic and social development, the quality of life there, and the level of debt, as well as the political and legal environment in these countries, and the local customs, the sort of cultural differences with China that might exist. These are some of our criteria for deciding in depth whether or not to go into such and such frontier market. Now, on the project level, first of all, we try to build a long-term relationship with the government in question. We try to reach consensus on the specific goals that we want to achieve there.
Many countries want to achieve modernization, industrialization, or wants to build green economy or modern service industry. Many countries are moving towards this end. Therefore, in doing business, we should get aligned with those countries. In this way, we can achieve a win-win situation. In doing business, for newly emerging economies, we should contribute to the sustainable economic social development of that country. So on this point, we are interested. Another point is that for newly emerging economies, there are many problems or issues to be handled. However, when Chinese companies are investing outbound, we need to learn international best practice and international norms. When we are investing in a country or we get an engineering contract in a country, our companies need to perform social responsibilities of the corporate citizenship. We need to protect the environment better and try to make contributions to the local community. In this way, we can have better business from the frontier market. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all those perspectives, and thank you for.
Xin cảm ơn các bạn đã nói hội bây giờ nó vào đây.
Address to anybody on the panel who'd care to pick it up is how does one build support in the societies for some of this institutional development? Whether you, and that's a question that we could address from the standpoint of individual investors, either local or multinational, coming in, you're trying to do something for the good of society in the course of undertaking some commercial activity. How do you build support? Or from the standpoint of policymakers, how do you get the person on the street to see that this is a desirable way to go? We were talking earlier amongst ourselves about the issue of water scarcity around the world, which several on the panel have had to deal with in different circumstances. The issue of pricing water would be an example. How do you convince politicians to price water? It's an extremely difficult and tricky and emotional issue at many levels. So anybody care to pick up on that?
I think in regards to water, it's a combination of pricing water and in reinforcing or enforcing the regulatory standards, because many countries will have regulatory standards for both the quality of water and the use of water, but won't enforce them. And I think to the discussion we had earlier, I think key to that is the government having the data. If the government has the data and understands the issue, then they can deal with it. It's not just a political issue. It becomes reality and something that you can discuss and what are the right approaches. Plus, if the governments understand that there are technologies, best practices to deal with water shortages, for example, that industry can use to use less water, that are also economically viable, that help companies not only use less water, be more energy efficient in their water cooling and heating processes, but also do it in a way that reduces costs, doesn't increase costs. Then there's that combination of environmental sustainability and economic sustainability, and that's the real sweet spot.
Simeon, and then
sorry, I found as a, let's say, economist turned politician recently, I found that people care a lot about, and society cares a lot about job creation. So if you say, here's a very large investor who can create 2,000 jobs in a country, a small country like Bulgaria, please tell us what you are looking. And they say, well, we need better roads so that we can get without breaking our goods and so on. We need lower taxes and so on. So you simply ask the investors, and at least in countries of Eastern Europe, I find that society actually is excited about foreign investment. There is a very pro-investor confidence and interest in that, and you just listen to what the investors say, and society actually gets excited about this. These are 400,000, 2,000 jobs. And you as a government can sort of have your priority. So for example, coming from many years at the World Bank before, I always thought that investors care a lot about the quality of the justice systems, and they do actually, but most foreign investors write contracts in such a way that they can arbitrate them in either London or Hong Kong or New York or Paris. So actually that's an important decision, but that's not one of the first 3 or 4 that come up. The first 3 or 4 that come up, at least in the case of Bulgaria, I mentioned infrastructure, low taxes, the way into the European Union market. So I think people would want foreign investors to say what they want, and that works.
You know,
Sorry. just want to touch on building institution, as you said earlier. I think my experience that one of the biggest mistake that a lot of the investor or company that want to do business in frontier market is they think very short term because they're looking at selling something to the market, and then once it's done, it's gone. But I think we need to take a step back. The beauty of the frontier market is that they don't see that many foreign investors sometimes. And so if you do the right in the first few years and build up that relationship and do the first few transactions correctly, the opportunity is there. And especially in the frontier market, when you start with a low base, so the growth is very high, so you can enjoy the growth with it. For example, in Vietnam, I have a business partner who came into Vietnam in early 1990, do a couple of deals, and just leave. And again, it's very difficult to reestablish themselves. But once they work with us, we try to explain to them that, look, you need to do small but consistent, being there, and build that relationship. And now, their profitability is one of the highest growth rate from Vietnam than any other market they have anywhere else in the world.
and I think we're all saying different shades of the same thing, which is have great government relations. And I think one of the challenges is to make sure that if we have an economic interest, I mean, in our case, a financial institution wants to offer products to its consumers, you have to understand how that serves a government need. So we talked about job creation in our business. It would certainly be financial literacy. It would be transparency of the economy. And if you can build both of those needs and manage both of those constituencies, I think it does help you build a sustainable long-term presence in a frontier market.
Has anybody ever encountered instances when there's a conflict in this, when you feel that the right thing should be done, but you're not able to get government support, or you're not able to communicate to the end user of the service that indeed this is worthwhile? And what do you do in those circumstances? It sounds, everything that you said sounds so great.
Well, it's just a lot of patience and education. I think it's a lot of time that when we, I'll give you an example. We were building a golf course in central Vietnam. And I said, golf course, what's that benefit to Vietnam? Why would a golf course be beneficial to Vietnam? But, it takes time to explain that, if you want to do a resort development, high class, you need tourists coming in, they do play golf. And golf course is part and parcel of resort development, tourism, and so on and so forth. So on a first cut, if you explain that to the authority, they would not understand what's that benefit to Vietnam, for example. The other benefit I see is that, once a golf course is being built, you got a number of industrial zones around that area because you have a lot of Korean, Japanese coming in and say, well, the first thing I'm going to do looking for a place to invest is I need to see a golf course around that area first. So that's part and parcel of attracting foreign investment also. But that, again, takes time to explain to policymaker.
And, sometimes you just need the cautionary tale. I mean, I think it's an unpopular thing to say, but we had what was a frontier market, wanted to build its own ATM switch because said we didn't want any of these foreign countries, and it was a 2-year painful multiple failure process, and so sometimes they just have to experience the alternative.
So it occurs to me that at least the two of you, Elizabeth and Erik, are involved in different kinds of infrastructure development, right? Yours is sort of more of a hard infrastructure, yours is a soft infrastructure. So we have a nice pairing in some sense. And both of you, I think, emphasize the importance of building bridges to the public sector. Prior to engaging in the investment process, presumably some sort of literacy program. Literally sounds as though you're trying to tell the government what to do. That's not what I mean. What I mean is co-education in some sense. and perhaps some ex-post difference adjudication of some sort. Is that a fair characterization of the working process?
And I think to tie in a couple of these points, in a number of frontier markets, we've gone in with what we thought was great technology, great capability from the United States that we wanted to bring and had challenges. And what we found out was what we really need to do is get strong local people, because you've got to have the capability on the ground, and the governments really aren't going to be open to you unless you have strong local people to support not only the job creation, but also the capability to service your customer right. So I think that's been a big learning for us is you got to build up the local capability as soon as you can to be successful with your customers, but also connecting to the government and really getting the right positioning.
I can confirm that governments do care a lot about jobs in the first place, but also about building some capacity that later can help not only that company, but the industry, and later on the government. So when we review foreign investors, we think, okay, these people are going to bring this type of technology that later on is going to be used in the government as well. Some of these people are going to move to government jobs in a few years, so you do care about this capacity transfer. I do think that it's important, and people even in the largest international investors forget sometimes to talk to different layers of the government. The governments do want to listen, do want to understand exactly what the issues are. One needs to be careful to tell the right story and the truthful story. I've recently had a case where European investor was entering the market and basically saying, well, you're offering us this, but the neighboring country is offering us that. And somehow perhaps thinking that because we are competitors for the project, I would not know what's happening in the neighboring country. Well, finance ministers also talk to each other, so I can easily call the country's minister, and he said nothing like that. Basically, this is what we are offering. And that sort of investor immediately loses some credibility with us. In that case, I simply told them, look, you told me this, but here is what it is. So if you would want to restart, that would be great. If you want to sort of have this sort of roundabout conversation, we can do that too, but let me tell you, we know what's on the other side. And that, I think you need to be truthful and just say, this is what we would like. Most of the time, the governments would actually deliver it because it's in their interest.
Mr. Zhu Hongjie,
我想呢，中国改革开放
Chinese reform and development experience also made a very clear answer to this question. China is introducing foreign capital, and Chinese companies are making investment outside of the country. At the beginning of reform and opening up a period, we face two bottlenecks. One is energy shortage. The second is the transportation issues. So infrastructure construction plays a key role in economic development. China Export and Import Bank supported a lot of overseas investment. Based on the policies of the frontier countries, we are making investment. We want to be aligned with the goals and objectives of the frontier markets. We want to support infrastructure projects in those frontier markets, so as to enable them to have a very good infrastructure for future economic investment and to attract more foreign investment.
Thank you. I was struck by your earlier comment when you talked about the criteria that your bank uses in going to other countries, and you had a whole long list, including, I noted, how different the practices there are from China. As well as the social temperature, if you will, or the social conditions in the country, and I think it bears some recollection that it's not just the state of the financial market that matters in going in and developing. Though as investors, that might be something that we'd all be focused on, but also the broader institutional environment. So thank you for that. I suggest we open, the floor is open for comments and questions. If you'd raise your hand, I think there's some mics, and if you can identify yourself. There's a lady in the middle right here. Raise your hand higher, please, so they can see you. Yeah, thank you. Just a brief identification, and then you can address the question to whoever you wish.
Hello, my name is Mariam Al-Foderi, and I'm from Agility, which is one of the only global logistics companies that actually comes from roots outside of Western Europe or the United States. The company is based in Kuwait. And This conversation has been very, very interesting in that it's really focused on what it takes to play in frontier markets. My question is the reverse. What can frontier markets and companies from frontier markets bring to regional and global growth?
Thank you. So what can companies from frontier markets bring to the rest of the world? So I'm going to call Elizabeth because of the idea of innovation, right, in some sense. Do you want to maybe take a stab at that?
Sure. I mean, certainly in our business, innovation generally. So companies in particular who have particular technologies, again, I'll go back to mobile because that's a prime example, but because people in frontier markets have figured out how to do things with what they have available, which, as we've been discussing, is scarcity of capital, scarcity of resources, it very often turns out to be that there are very cost-effective technology and product solutions that get developed in these frontier markets, and then we can then add global standards and global scale, as Erik discussed, and bring those back into developed markets.
Would anyone else care to comment on what can companies from the frontier markets take to the rest of the world?
I think just to maybe elaborate a bit on what was just said, I found, again, in my 15 months in Bulgarian politics, that some of the investors that come to Bulgaria are actually from like markets, or emerging markets, let's say, or frontier. And precisely as Elizabeth said, it's because they have had similar situations to develop. So sometimes, for example, they bring technologies that can work if electricity goes out from time to time. Now in Bulgaria, fortunately, that doesn't happen anymore, but you never know. It did happen in past years, and it's very important for some industries that they have constant supply. For example, if you're a surgeon, you really want to have the supply. So we recently had a large successful investor come into the Bulgarian market that operates hospitals, but essentially the innovation, which came from an Asian market actually, was an emerging Asian market, was to have such backup technology that whatever happens to electricity grid, it continues operating. In some of the more developed markets, maybe that doesn't strike them that electricity may go out. It's a simple example, but it points to this innovation in times of not so well developed infrastructure or institutions and so on.
I think one of the nice things is that when you reflect on that question, there's so many examples of specialized expertise buckets that have popped up in different parts of the world. Just sitting off the top of my head, you look at biofuels, which have their problems, but coming out of Brazil with the natural endowments and the policy experiments that have unfolded over 30 years in Brazil, those companies are taking it to the rest of the world. You look at water conservation in the Middle East, different parts, particularly in Israel, very, very interesting. You look at miniaturization of pediatric heart surgery in southern India. You would not think of southern India as being the place where the best pediatric heart surgery is unfolding. But the reason it's unfolding there is that Indians, unfortunately for me, tend to have heart disease. And there's a lot of Indians, and so you got a lot of people with heart disease, and somebody has practiced and practiced and practiced and become, if you will, the Henry Ford of heart surgeons sitting in southern India. So there's a whole host of environmental, accidental, policy experiments and contingencies that have unfolded. And if we just keep our eyes open, we can tap into all sorts of expertise pools. So thank you for that question. The gentleman behind there, yeah.
大家好，我来自
From financial websites, I have a question for you. For China, there is a great regional divide between Western countries and Eastern countries. Well, for western part of the country, it can be considered a frontier market, while coastal regions can be considered as developed regions. So how can we balance the regional economic development, and how can we cooperate with other countries to develop western part of China?
How can we?
我想这个是
For frontier markets, I think this is a division among different countries. Just now, you mentioned that a regional gap between western and eastern part of China Yes, there's such a gap. Chinese government, the central government adopted the policy of Western development and rejuvenating the northeastern industrial base just to narrow the regional gaps. However, we cannot divide the regions into frontier regions. In China, GDP, per capita GDP was 3,700. Western areas 1,000, eastern areas 5,000. But we should not divide the country into two parts. This is a national domestic issue, but not an international issue.
I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on the broader question, maybe not so much about China, but the idea that there are pockets in any country. I can take my own country of India. There are certainly parts of India that do extremely well, and there are parts that are extremely poor and in really bad shape. And the question is, I suppose if I can reframe the question might be, is it the job of the state to somehow reallocate resources to compensate for inadequacies, or are there roles that other people can play in that process over time?
Can I just take that? I think definitely there's need to be a partnership between the state and also the private company sectors. I think the states always play a role in terms of providing incentive for companies as you go there. You know, if you provide tax holiday and certain other policy, then company that beneficial to themselves, they will go there. And I think it's always that's the best way, rather than heavy-handedly interfering with that particular region. I think the best is set the policy and let the private sector take over.
To provide inducements to entrepreneurs to go inside.
That's right.
Okay. Questions from the floor? In my, you know, I've spent 20 years teaching at Harvard, and I don't think I've ever stared at 150 people with nobody having anything to say. We now have 7 hands. There's one at the back. There's one at the back, yeah.
Thank you very much. John Manners-Bell from Transport Intelligence. I'd like to return to this question, which was raised a little bit earlier on corruption. Frontier markets, I think most of us will admit that corruption can be endemic from the government down. So how can a multinational with very different standards of behavior actually work and be present in the market without adopting the local business practices? Is it a case that you just avoid that market completely, or do you try and bring your own values and pressures to bear?
I'll go back to some of the things that I said. First of all, I don't think you can compromise on your company's standards around the world. I think you have to have one standard and have that same standard everywhere in the world. But at the same time, I just fundamentally believe that in these frontier markets, there is corruption. There's corruption everywhere in the world. But you can maintain those standards, and if you're bringing value, if you've got local talent that's got the right capability to bring value to your customers, you can find ways to do it without being corrupt, without bowing to the corruption, and still realize growth opportunities. I believe that. We train our people. We talk to them the day they join our company and talk to them about the standards and make sure that it's very clear. We make it very easy for people to report if they've got a concern about anybody in their company or somebody out in the marketplace or with the governments, and then we try to help them address any issues. But I fundamentally believe that the world, in the long run, companies have to be abiding by some international global corruption standard in order to be successful. And we'll make that happen over time, and you just have to keep your standards.
You know, I would just add, I mean, Erik's absolutely right, and there are a handful of places, either because of corruption or just extreme political instability, that would just be difficult to operate in. But Erik's right, you must keep your standards, and sometimes there can be a combination, whether it is hiring local talent or partnering for example, with a local technology provider, another multinational company, an example of something that we did in Africa, brought in a global bank. We're obviously a global company, but the technology provider for the payments infrastructure was a local company, which actually gave us access to an intelligence about the market, and it was a market that had a pretty corrupt government, but we managed to see our way through and still stick to the standards to which we had to adhere, actually.
And if I may add, again, you tell your story, and you tell it not only to the government, but you tell it to the public. If a company comes to a country like Bulgaria and says we're going to create 500 or 1,000 new jobs, these jobs are going to be in this region, they're going to develop in such and such way, some other contracting firms are going to benefit from it. When you have democracy, when you have elections, it's very difficult, even if you face somewhere some government officials that ask for bribes and so on. The rest of them would want to do this project simply because they're going to be elected on such projects for providing jobs and so on. So you should be public and truthful about what you're bringing to the country, and it actually works.
Mm. Can we just go back for a second to the criteria that you use? Implicitly, this is addressed more to the multinationals in terms of, though I suppose it applies to everybody who is expanding beyond their borders. Don was talking about expanding into Thailand and Cambodia and so on. How do you decide where you do business? I mean, corruption is one feature. It would apply to the Chinese going to Africa also. What are some of the criteria that are top of mind for you, other than obviously the size of the market that you're investing in? Anybody?
Well, the number one criteria for us is what is the opportunity to start to look at it. And then once you decide that the opportunity fits our capabilities and is worth going after, then what's the best way to go after the opportunity, and does it make sense, and does the country meet the criteria that you think you can do business successfully and in a global standard way. And for us, I mean, a lot of the world fits that criteria. There are a few markets that don't. If you do business in an open, transparent way and work with the government and companies that want to be successful over time.
Thank you. Well, talking about developing and frontier markets, the major challenge is often weak rule of law and the prevalence sometimes of corruption. And if you don't take certain actions, you're threatened with loss of the opportunity or the project. If it's a very promising project, you're sometimes threatened with loss of it if you don't take certain actions. But we are against Chinese companies acting illegally in order to do deals. We have a blacklisting system, and if we find such occurrences, the company will be added to the blacklist and we'll no longer do business with them.
Encouraging to hear of the blacklist.
Excellent.
That rules them out from a consideration in the future. The other mechanism that I've run into with local and multinational companies is making public any approaches to them. I'm just making it known to the widespread media of the existence of that attempt, in an attempt to somehow even out the playing field over long periods of time. And again, it's the principle that sunlight is the best disinfectant that seems to come through in many of these ideas. All right, gentleman back here, yeah.
Hi, Ravi Kane. I'm a professor of chemical engineering. In the criteria for investing in a frontier market, if I heard the interpretation correctly, one of the criteria was level of debt. And I was wondering, given the current, given how sensitive the issue is currently, if you could elaborate on that a bit. Is that sovereign debt, consumer debt? Is there a certain level that elicits concern, that kind of thing?
I think Mr. Hongjie.
Mainly sovereign debt, levels of sovereign debt, the rate and also the rate of solvency of the country concerned, because if we support a project taking place in that country, we have to look at how to improve the prospects for sustainable development. If we, on the other hand, saddle it with debt that it can't repay, that threatens to cause social instability, and so we're less willing.
It's my adopted home, I want to know.
Well, some Chinese companies are willing to take stakes in American companies, but they get turned back by the US authorities.
That actually raises another very interesting question. I mean, I sit on the boards of many large US companies, and it's interesting to see, and I don't know how many of you share this feeling, that the amount of protectionist rumblings that have popped up reasonably frequently on all sides, in the developed world and the developing world, to me has been a little bit alarming. And, you know, that's what Mr. Hongjie is referring to. In any case, thank you for the clarification of sovereign. There was a question back here.
Ernesto Bertrelli, investor. Very often in most countries, emerging countries, you need a local sponsor. Doesn't that add to the complexity, lead to corruption, and increases the cost of doing business in those countries?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us the reasons for it, and maybe how to choose or deal with the issue of the local sponsor?
Do you have a particular country in mind that you're referring to, or?
Well, most frontier country, I believe, do require that. Middle East, for instance, are the
right.
sort of countries.
Well, you're very right. You should look for local partners wherever you go. It'll make things go much more smoothly for your investment, and it's a growing trend, I think.
Anybody want to?
I guess the question is really, in some cases, you need to sort of debating whether the local partner be a government-owned entity or a private company.
Mm-hmm.
And that also make a difference in that frontier market. And the question about a local partner is always brought up, especially in Southeast Asia where I work. But definitely a lot of the companies do go and looking for a local partner, but the question is always between a government-owned company or private. And I think as people start to find out, they do tend to go with private company more often. It's just reducing one level of bureaucracy, I guess.
In some countries, as was mentioned, in many industries, it's actually required to have a local partner, although I think this requirement and this regulation is going away in many countries. For example, in the European Union and in general in Eastern Europe, it's actually prohibited to have such a regulation. So in other words, you can invest without a local partner. I found, however, that often it's wise, as was already mentioned, to have a local partner simply because the level of consulting services in many of the emerging markets is not so high yet. So a local partner can actually tell you about many things, how to follow regulation, which level of government officials to work with, and so on, that you wouldn't know otherwise. So it's not really how to deal with corrupt government officials. It's simply to have enough market intelligence that otherwise you would not have. And even in countries, Bulgaria has all the main KPMG, this, that, and the other consulting services, but still, maybe because they are just establishing offices and so on, it's good, I think, often to have a local partner simply because they know how the market operates, and it operates legally, not how to avoid regulation, but how to deal with it so you don't have problems down the road.
And I agree with everything that's been said. I think local partners can be extremely valuable in frontier countries. The only thing I would add is that spend the time up front with the potential partners to make sure that whoever you go with is somebody that's going to, the relationship's going to last, that you have similar values. The times that we've made mistakes was because we moved too fast to get a partner and didn't make sure that we did our diligence well and get to the right partner for the long term.
So just to flesh out the question, if I may, for a second, I think his question was, why do you see these? Why do you see the emphasis on this when you do? And very often there's a capacity building aspect to this also, which is that the local country is basically saying, we want you to help develop our local base, and effectively you will be transferring some technology to the local partner. Now, my view is that you look at this in the long term and say that that's part of the function of the investor, is capitalizing on the local opportunity, but also helping develop the local human capital. And in that sense, maybe it's not such a bad thing. Though I agree with the spirit of the question that very often it makes it more difficult. And perhaps that comes back to Erik's comment that you have to be careful in deciding who you do business with in the first instance. But it's a bit more complex, I think, than always being a panacea to somebody's problems.
To me, the part of the choosing the right partner is that they're going to allow you to expand your own company's capabilities over time in that market. You don't rely on them forever as a sales agent. You build the full capability.
That's great. Way back there, there's a gentleman there.
My name is Jochen Wermuth with Wermuth Asset Management. We've been investing in Russia. I'm not sure it's a frontier market for many years, and in 17 years been able to do business without paying bribes or without having met a mafiosi. Right. So I think many of the perception about frontier markets simply wrong. There are no ice bears in the street of Moscow, and generally people are quite welcoming, just like Beijing and Tianjin are very nice. So I think that's one thing. But as far as shining the light, I think that's what worked very well. The German Business Association signed a commitment that we would not pay bribes and not do this sort of business. That helped a lot. But on to my question, which is really to the Exim export representative. What is the strategy you have with Russia now? Be it G8, be it G20, or be it a frontier market. We all know about the big pipeline that you're building from Siberia to China. But there are many, many other areas, and I heard from the Chinese in Beijing that the Russians look tough, but they have a good heart, and therefore the Chinese like working with them. I was wondering what your plans are in this direction. Thank you.
You, Mr. Hongjie.
Well, if we talk about Russia, Russia is certainly an important neighbor of ours and a strategic partner of China. We have that strategic partnership in place. We have strong complementarity of the two economies as well between China and Russia. And so there are very good prospects for the economic relationship between the two of us. If we look at trade, however, if we compare that to the complementarities of our economies, there's still not enough trade between the two. It's only about $50 billion and growing very slowly. It's not in line with the strategic partnership that we have and that we aim to develop. And I'm sure the two governments will be taking action to resolve this lack of symmetry, if you like.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. But it's encouraging to hear of the positive experience in Russia. So thank you for sharing that. We have time for maybe one more question. Okay. Well, we got a couple more. There's one over here. Take this. Let's go here.
Tomasz Zawadzki, I work for Russian Business Magazine Expert. I just wanted to ask if any of our guests here have any experience in investing both in China and any Asian frontier markets, and compare the attitude that investors are facing in China and frontier markets, and how this attitude is actually evolving now. Thank you.
Investments in China compared to investments in other places?
Well,
how do attitudes vary?
About
the attitudes of people in China versus other frontier markets.
Well, yeah. I think China wants to aggressively develop industry and oil and gas, and has water challenges. So for us, the opportunity in both the general industry water treatment and oil and gas water issues has been very positive and very welcoming. In the last 2.5 years, we've doubled the number of employees we have in China. We now have close to 1,000. We've built a manufacturing facility. We've installed a technology center in Shanghai and are investing very aggressively and with good returns and very excited about the future. So we've had a great experience in China. And I would say that the rest of Asia is also growing very rapidly. It's very interesting to me to come from the United States, where there's a lot of concern about the economy and the double dip and what's happening. And as soon as you hit the ground in China, or 2 weeks ago I was in India, all you hear about is growth and all these tremendous growth opportunities. So I think it's a very exciting place for global companies to be investing and to be positioning for growth, not only today, but for many years to come.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. I was tempted to ask a question about the R&D Center, but I think I'll refrain. Let me take the opportunity to thank the panelists. I think what you heard was a wide spectrum of experiences from local and multinational businesses, policymakers, and entrepreneurs on the challenges of adapting to the existing institutional environment, as well as continue to work to upgrading it in the future so that all frontier markets become emerging markets, become developed markets. Thank you very much.